Hi everyone, my name is Nisreen Kamal. I am the Arabic editor of the China Global South project. And let me tell you a little bit about the work we're doing before you get to today's podcast. So basically, if you check the news to look for stories about China's ties with the United States or Europe, you will definitely find a lot. But when it comes to stories about China's relations with developing countries, which we call the Global South, it's a different situation. So this is where we come in because we provide you with in-depth analysis and daily reporting about China's activities in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even the Americas. And our services are available in 3 languages, which are English, Arabic, and French. You can try it for free for 30 days at chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Once again, that's chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Thank you.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, China Global South Managing Editor, Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. Cobus, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
And we're also joined today by China Global South Francophone Editor, Geraud from the lovely island of Mauritius. A good afternoon to you, Geraud.
Good afternoon, Eric. Good afternoon, Cobus.
Today we're going to talk about an issue that is near and dear to the both of you and to me as well, education. And it's a topic that we actually haven't talked about in quite some time, in part because the China-Africa education relationship has really been on hold for much of the past 3 years since the pandemic. Leading up to the pandemic in 2019, 2020 or so, China stood out in many ways from many other countries as one of the largest, and if not the largest destination for African university students to go. France and China were competing for that top spot. Prior to the pandemic, about 60,000 African students every year went to go study in China, a remarkable number when you think about it. And today we're going to be talking about specifically doctoral candidates. Those are the PhD students. And right before the pandemic started in 2019, there were 26,000 foreign doctoral candidates enrolled in Chinese universities. And get this, 6,000 of those PhD students were from African countries. That's almost a quarter. Cobus, that is a remarkable figure in my view. And again, it's a number in many respects that I don't think any other country can compete against, save France, for example, because again, their academic and educational relationships with African countries remains quite strong. Let's talk a little bit about some of the background on this educational relationship between China and Africa.
Education has been a major way for China to increase people-to-people ties with the continent and with the rest of the Global South. There's obviously, as many other Global South countries also have many students going to China to study. But this is partly through government scholarships, but there's also a lot of privately funded African students studying at Chinese universities. So to a large extent, this, kind of gathered speed because African students were facing so many constraints in some of the other places that many of them would like to study, particularly in Europe and in the United States. So during the kind of years that the intake to China increased rapidly, it decreased in other places. And, obviously during the Trump administration, there were also official kind of blocks added to student visas for African students from specific countries. So that plus cost plus the difficulty to get visas has largely kept many African students out of Western universities. And a lot of them then kind of look to China for alternatives.
So, Geraud, you are one of those African students back in the day who chose to go to China. You studied at Renmin University in Beijing, one of the more prestigious universities in China. Tell us a little bit about the calculation that you made in deciding to go to study in China.
Just like Cobus said, it was at that moment where, China was more accessible to African students than other countries, for instance. In my case, I was not on scholarship. I was a private student, and that was even making my choice a bit tricky in a way that at the beginning, I wanted to go to London. I wanted to go to LSE, to London University, but somehow the process was too long and too fastidious. And someone told me, there are good universities in China. You have more and more African students going to China. And I just applied. At that time, it was 2006. It was quite straightforward. I applied and I got my admission for language studies, and I got my visa fairly fast. And that's how I got in China. So the whole process took me, I'd say, a month or a month and a half to get the admission and to get the visa process. And 1 month later, I was in China. So the process was quite easy and quite fast. That's how I get in China that fast. And that's why it was easy in a certain way.
Now, for most of last year, there was a growing sense of anxiety for a lot of African students who had started their degrees in China, but because of the zero COVID policies, they were blocked from returning. Those restrictions have now started to lift, and there is a palpable sense of relief from students from all over the world, but particularly from the global south, that they're finally able to get back in to China to continue their studies. And again, we're going to focus today on PhD programs and those doctoral programs. So a lot of those students are going back. But when they go back, they're going to have maybe a difficulty in completing their degree, according to some research that's being done by 3 scholars who we are thrilled to have on the show today. They've started some research, and there was an initial blog post on their research with a paper coming later. And the article, which we'll put in the show notes, China gives scholarships to Africans, but then moves the doctoral goalpost. It was written by David Mills, an associate professor in the Department of Education at Oxford University. A very good afternoon to you, David. Thank you for joining us on the show.
It's a pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you, Eric.
And also at Oxford University, Anding Shi, who is a PhD student in higher education in the Department of Education at Oxford University. Welcome to the show, Anding.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone.
And finally, we're thrilled to have Natasha Robinson, who's a lecturer at the School of Education at the University of Bristol, but formerly at Oxford University. And that completes the trio. A very good afternoon to you, Natasha.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much.
Okay, David, let's start with you. You 3 interviewed 27 Ethiopian, Ghanaian, and Tanzanian PhD candidates who are all doing their PhDs in China. Quick question right off the bat. Why did you focus on Africans specifically as opposed to, say, students from other parts of the global south in terms of the focus of your research?
Sure, great question, Eric. So this is part of a larger project where we're trying to understand the changing nature of global higher education. And obviously this is a booming sphere. There are many more universities all over Africa and across the global south. But where we study them, we often study them from the perspective of the university cultures we know, which are the global north. So we thought it was really important to understand sort of academic mobility, people moving to study from one place to another, and to do that across places that have been less studied. So Africa to China just hadn't been analysed as much as other places. I know a bit about African universities. Natasha knew a lot about what's happening in China. So it seemed a great combination, and it's turned out to be a very, very rich and important area.
Anding, in the paper, there's references to Chinese universities kind of moving the goalposts in relation to the PhD rules, allowing PhD students to graduate. What kind of goalpost moving are we talking about, and which kind of rules are involved?
I think the previously doctoral students in China, they are not required to publish. But for international doctoral students since 2010, especially after the Ministry of Education released some policy on the international students should have the same training objective and also public graduation requirements as the local students. And many universities begin to require international doctoral students also publish some SCI paper or SSAI paper, same as the Chinese doctoral students.
So, Natasha, when I was reading the article, something really stood out when I read the title and I read the article itself. I wanted to know if those changes of policies and norms that you've mentioned in the articles are impacting African students in a very distinctive or in a particular way, or it's kind of impacting the whole PhD bodies, or it's only in what way African students are impacted in a certain way.
The policy applies across all students. The policy is not designed to impact African students in any particular way. But because African students often have to leave China once their official period of PhD or doctoral study has been completed, it often means that they are back in their African countries having not received any PhD qualification. And so then this makes it very difficult once they, for example, arrive back in Tanzania without their PhD certificate to then move on with their lives or to get jobs in their home countries, particularly in the academic space. Unlike Chinese students, for whom it's also very inconvenient, of course, but they're not then moving away from their supervisors, moving away from their academic institutions after their official period of study is completed.
So, Natasha, if I understand correctly, the main goalpost that you guys are talking about that is moving is this idea of the publication, and that's causing the problem, correct? That you have to get published in an international journal or some type of publication, and many of the students started their programs not expecting to have to do this. They may have finished their programs, and now they're told that they have to publish something, and that's what's delaying. Is that the crux of the problem?
Yes, absolutely. That's it. And so many of these students started their PhDs thinking either that they wouldn't have to publish or that the quality of journal that they need to publish in wouldn't matter. So they could publish in a journal that's actually quite easy to publish in, and so it would really be more for formality than any great obstacle. But I think as Chinese universities have become more interested in publication metrics and in their global ranking, as universities, there's a big push and a pressure on Chinese universities to publish more and more in international journals. And holding PhD students, holding back their graduation prospects until they publish in international journals has actually proven for Chinese universities to be quite an effective way of squeezing out more publications. But it is also a little bit deceptive. I mean, many of these students have started their PhD journeys with a false idea of what it's going to require to graduate with a PhD qualification.
David, I just wanted to, I was hoping you could provide a little bit of context to how unusual this is, because if I did my graduate work in Japan, and for Japanese universities, that was standard. Like I had to publish 2 papers in journals in order to graduate. And, and I was looking at Ivy League, rules, and some of them were mentioning that recruiters would actually favor like applicants to PhD programs. Some of them are already under pressure to have published stuff from their master's work in order to get into Ivy League programs. So I was wondering, is what we're seeing essentially a kind of a Chinese universities kind of pulling themselves up to a kind of a slightly higher kind of standard where European and American universities are already operating?
So it's a great question. I think some of that is the case, and certainly there is the amazing rise through the university rankings of Chinese universities. I mean, obviously, China, with the Shanghai Jiaotong ranking, was the first to create a worldwide university ranking. And its universities are now at the top in many of the science computing fields. Now, not every doctoral program expects you to have published along the way. And certainly within the UK, there's no expectation that you have to publish in order to graduate. And certainly in most African universities, not all of them, some of them have now begun to move to that. But the problem, of course, becomes one of not just publishing, but where you publish, and the expectation that you can get your article into the very top journals. It's very demanding for a doctoral student. So I think you're right. I think it is a change in expectation. It is about China wanting to be the best university system in the world. And then the ways in which African students, if they are writing a lot and doing a lot of publishing, then they're really valuable for their supervisors, especially if they're able to write well. So for some students, it's about just getting enough publications to graduate. And for others, there's a sense in which they're helping their supervisors. And then they sort of, the other thing I would say here, of course, is that each university has its own rules and regulations. So even if the national regulations say one thing, a university might have another set of informal rules, and a supervisor might themselves have expectations. So it's quite complicated.
Yeah, I guess that's my question, is how pervasive is this? Is this something that your research, David, when you looked across China, was happening many of the universities? Is it predominantly at a certain tier of universities? Give us a sense of the scope of what we're talking about here in terms of these changes in their strategies in order to elevate their prominence in the academic world through publishing and then using the work of grad students to do that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I think Andy will have lots to say about this as she does her research on this. But what's interesting about it is that some of the elite universities are beginning to step back from some of the sort of the rankings culture, because it can be very destructive. If you're just chasing a score, in chasing a number of publications, it doesn't make for good thinking, for good research. So I think what you probably see in China is the mid-ranking universities wanting to get up the ranks, pushing their students a bit harder. But there's also a bit of a backlash against that. So some universities are saying, look, we don't want to play this rankings game. It will really vary by field as well. People we were interviewing were mostly in either applied fields or in education, business. So then others in sciences, there was much more of an expectation they published in the very best journals. So it really varied by field and by university.
David, to follow up on just what you just said, talking about the ranking of a university, and since we are talking about a graduate student, and that's something really that strikes me in a certain way, because from an African perspective, when you go to higher education, PhD, you want to go to those higher education programs. You see in Beijing, you have Beijing Taishui, you have Jiaotong, and you have all those high universities. In the scholarship program, when they offer the scholarship to African students, did you find if they put right away the criteria for those students to apply? Because when you read the article, you have the kind of feeling that most of those African students or PhD students are kind of blindsided when they get into the program. Do they know that beforehand, or it's just something that just changed along the way and they have to adapt?
That's a really great question. I think perhaps we should have asked that more clearly of our students. My sense is that some of them are already academics, and they get offered a scholarship through a government program, and they know they need to get a PhD in order to stay teaching in African universities. So it's a great option because it's funded. They might have applied for scholarships to Europe or to the UK or to America and might not have got them. So you could say it's the best option they've got, so they take it up. Probably sometimes those things aren't spelled out as much as they should be. It's also sometimes quite hard to know what the informal expectations are. But Natasha, you might want to comment on that as well.
Yes, this actually was something that we spoke to several students about. And one of the really interesting things is that not only were the goalposts shifting during their PhD program, so they were signing up to something that then changed during the course of their PhD program, but often the publishing requirements were very much left to the discretion of their supervisors. And so sometimes that could turn into a slightly abusive relationship where, for example, we interviewed one really phenomenal Ghanaian PhD candidate who was publishing very well in international journals and was also able to publish in English because her English language was so good, while her PhD supervisor did not speak English and so wasn't able as easily to publish in international journals. And her PhD supervisor kept changing the goalposts so that he would keep her publishing for him before allowing her to graduate. And so those kind of manipulative interpersonal relationships was also something that we were picking up alongside the broader trend of university rankings and publishing culture.
And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of context about where the Chinese academic system is in relation to rankings and particularly to like journal citations at the moment. Because as Natasha mentioned, there's been, for a long time, there's been this increasing kind of ramping up kind of pressure on these universities to publish more and more. But over the last while, particularly during the COVID shutdown, I've heard several Chinese academics kind of mentioning that there's a kind of a counter pressure on them now, where it's actually getting harder to, for example, to go to foreign conferences, and there's kind of shifts in this kind of ongoing kind of like focus on international journals and kind of the Western journal publication system. So I was wondering if you could like give us a little bit of background about like what's happening in China in relation to this kind of drive for kind of external validation of the Chinese academic system.
I think during the COVID, there are many restrictions for other people, including the academics. So for scholars, I feel like they may not participate in many international conferences, but the publication in the international journals is continuing. So I feel like there's no much impact on the publishing issues, but there might be more impact on their conference participation and might be collaboration. But I also feel like there are many like virtual online meetings and webinars during the COVID. So I feel like there might develop another kind of international collaborations and these kind of behaviors. Yeah.
To follow up on that question, I'd like to go to Andy or even Natasha to kind of clarify that point. Natasha, you mentioned the fact that the relation with the supervisor has been keys to how PhD students are going to graduate and where they're going to graduate. I even remember in my time, it's always been the case that the supervisor will basically hold the key to determine if you're gonna have your scholarship extended or not, or if you're going to graduate. So in that context, when those changes are happening, how the Ministry of Education or even university are kind of intervening especially for those scholarship students, because you mentioned that for African students, the higher pressure is the fact that many of them have to go back in Africa. They cannot stay in China. I think it's also the case for most of foreign students. So for African, they have to go back. But when they go back in that context, their scholarship are just cut off or they're extended, or what's happening currently, what's happening in that context, and what university is kind of the role the university is playing or the Ministry of Education is playing into balancing that issue.
So I think certainly a lot of African students that we interviewed did not feel very protected by their university if they didn't have a good relationship with their supervisor. I mean, we should say that many of those that we interviewed did have a good relationship with their supervisor. It certainly wasn't universal that these relationships were abusive. But the university structures more broadly didn't seem to play as much of a part. But one of the really concerning things about COVID and the zero COVID policy in China is that when the foreign students, the African students, left China to continue their studies from their home countries in order to avoid the lockdown, then their university fees continued to be paid, but their living stipend was not paid. So their living stipend was conditional on them living in China in university accommodation. And so that created huge financial pressures. But I think certainly with the scholarship, I mean, once the student has finished their research and submitted papers for publication, then largely their formal relationship with the university has ended. So they no longer need to pay fees to the university, but equally they're no longer receiving a stipend from that university. And as any academic knows, that the actual publishing process of a journal article can take years. I mean, it can take, up to 12 months to get the first round of peer review back. So often these students have finished their formal studies, have returned to their home countries, and are now simply waiting for journals to decide whether their journal articles are accepted. And during that time, they're not receiving any scholarship or stipend.
So they're in this kind of limbo then, just not really a student, they're not graduated, they're just kind of waiting, right?
Yes, and then they're barred from academic jobs in their home countries because they don't have the right paperwork. So it's particularly challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine. David, just very quickly, in terms of when you looked at the different universities and you spoke with the different students, there's a huge range of quality in the various universities in China. And that's not surprising. China is a very big country. It has a lot of universities. There's a huge range of quality in the United States, in Europe as well. But we tend to think of Chinese universities, we tend to think of the big ones, Beijing University, Tsinghua, Renmin University, Jiao Tong, or Fudan. Those are the big ones. But a lot of African students are going to provincial universities and universities that don't always have the best programs set up for foreign students. So separately from the goalpost moving around the publications, what did you hear in the research and in your interviews about the quality of the education and the programs that these students were participating in, and whether or not the African students that you spoke with were satisfied?
So good question. You're absolutely right that there are communities of African students in places that are well beyond the sort of known elites. But then there are also very strong centers of African studies in some of those places as well. So, for example, Zhejiang Normal University has sponsored and co-hosted the China-Africa Think Tanks Forum, which is part of FOCAC, the FAFOCA process, since 2010. So there's a big community of students there. I think what you find, and again, is a mixed picture, but some students finding themselves sort of in a demanding, big sort of research team environment, especially in the sciences, and finding that sometimes really supportive and really exciting to be part of a team, especially if they feel able to contribute. Others finding themselves either isolated or not treated well by their supervisors. And I think it would be hard to say which universities were doing better than others, but certainly some are carrying on and building relationships with their students, or rather, their PhD graduates, and sustaining those links afterwards, which would suggest that they are building long-term research collaborations. And I think I'm sure that's one of the sort of inevitable consequences of so many African students, so researchers going to study in China, is that they will be building strong research links for the long term if their relationship has been good.
Geraud, I wonder if I can ask you, like, from your experience in your own life, like, how academically satisfying were your studies at a Chinese university, and particularly kind of how much supporting help and books and materials and other kind of crucial materials did you actually receive as a foreign student there?
That's really interesting that you asked me that question, because it's almost the kind of question I wanted to ask to our guest. So personally, my own experience has been quite interesting, because I remember when I did undergrad there, it was when you start your first year, they tend kind of, in Renmin, they were separating you foreign student and Chinese student. So there was not much of a mix between us and Chinese student. That was for almost 2 years. And after the second year, we started to mix with with Chinese students. So from a life perspective, the experience was different. It was not what I was imagining when I would go maybe to the US or to the UK, or to be mixed with the local student. In China, it was a bit different. So the support that I got from a university in general, personally, it was good. Renmin University, being Renmin University, it was like they kind of had a quite strict follow-up policy on foreign students. And I also noticed something: when you are a private student, a self-sponsored student, comparing to a scholarship student, the rules were kind of different. The follow-up and the intention that you'd be receiving were kind of different. And personally, on my case, I noticed that the follow-up on private student was more, tailored more. They were more focused on you. They would be more attending to your need or something like that. But for scholarship student, it was quite a bit difficult from time to time when they had to exchange with the supervisor, with the professor. It was quite difficult because you had so many layers of people who needed to intervene to get, for example, an extension for a student who was supposed to graduate who did not graduate. But for a private student, it was quite different because maybe he was paying. I don't know. I think that was maybe the case, but that's my own experience on that. Yeah, my last question would be for all of you guys. I don't know, maybe Natasha or David, or maybe Andigno's going to have to respond to that. When you talk to those students after their own experience, at the end, did you notice any regret in a way that say, I wish I could have gone somewhere else, or I thought that China would be better, or you feel that they have this kind of, or they have this understanding that, yeah, rules have changed along the way, but overall the experience was good, or you feel that they say, if I had to do it differently, I wouldn't come to China? What did you see? What were they feeling?
Great question. I'm still struck by my memory of one couple of students who, we keep saying students, they actually were already academics employed in an African university. They'd come back to their university in Ghana. It was a small new university. And they were really excited about putting into practice some of the things and ideas they brought from China around expectations around research and running seminars and publishing. So there's an example of people who were really sort of inspired by their doctoral education in China. But of course, there are other stories that are rather different. Natasha might want to come in here.
I certainly haven't heard of any students regretting their choice. I think, as we said before, often China isn't a first choice for many of these African students. They, had the world been different, they would have rather studied in Europe or the US. But given that this opportunity was made available to them, I think all of the students would have taken that opportunity again. But that didn't mean that they weren't often quite eager just to finish and leave. I think the experience of living in China for a lot of African students changed their opinion of China in quite a negative way, particularly because they might have experienced quite a bit of racism, for example, or just the challenges of living in quite a different context. So although there was no regret, there was also often an eagerness to get home.
And Anding, we're going to give you the final word on this. Maybe you can just reflect a little bit on the research that you did with David and Natasha and pick up where they left off.
Actually, I can talk about my opinion of doctoral education in China for local students and for international students. As far as I know, China have two kinds of doctoral program for international students. The first one is taught in English. The second one is taught in Mandarin. And I feel like these two kind of students actually they do not necessarily have to mix. It depends on the supervisors. And I feel like for students taught in Chinese, they usually have more communications with the local Chinese students. And in my experience, when I was doing my master's degree in China, I never saw some other international student taught in English supervised by my supervisors. So I feel like it depends on the supervisors, their own style. So I feel like students' experience may also differ depending on the supervision model.
The article is China Gives Scholarships to Africans, but then moves the doctoral goalpost. It's on opendemocracy.net. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. It was written by David Mills, an associate professor in the Department of Education at Oxford University, Natasha Robinson, a lecturer at the School of Education at the University of Bristol, and Anding Shi, who you just heard from, who is a PhD student in higher education, also at Oxford University. David, Anding, and Natasha, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Cobus, a fascinating take on an issue that we've been following for many years. Again, this idea of the moving of the goalpost. It was hard for me to understand how much of this is unique to African students, which it doesn't seem like it is in that sense. They were just focusing on African students, but it applies to students from other countries as well. I guess, the academic world is an exotic world for me. I am the child of an academic, so I've been surrounded by it. But the way you guys work and the culture and that whole world is it's very exotic to me. And just the way and the politics and the need for publication and the pace of things. And I guess what I'm trying to get my head around is how much of what we're hearing from these scholars about what's happening in China in terms of moving the goalposts is unique to what's happening in China. Or is this just the way that it works in the academic world, not only in China, but in other countries?
I think most of this is actually not unique to China. And, in a lot of ways, China is moving towards a position where a lot of top-tier universities around the world already are. In the sense that having publication requirements for PhD graduation is quite standard. What is quite tough, though, and I think that that's context that the people should take into account, is that this is clearly linked to the Chinese authorities want to not only have a lot of publications, but to have publications in the world's top journals. So there's thousands of journals around the world, and only a smaller fraction of them are listed in these kind of very high status indices of journals. So making a requirement for PhD students to publish in these listed journals makes a lot of sense for Chinese universities, because the more you publish in these listed journals, the higher your status is. And that makes there's the same, kind of like logic for the Chinese education authorities. But making PhD students submit to listed journals is a pretty steep undertaking. You're up against a lot of tenured professors who are also fighting, tooth and nail to get their articles into those same journals. So this is going to be very tough for any PhD student. Making it a requirement for all PhD students, and particularly also for students from the global south, who were not studying in their first language, is quite a tall order. It's not unique. Like it's true for a lot of universities already have that rule, and part of this is kind of China pulling themselves up to that rank. But it still shows how tough the academic system is, and how much pressure there is on grad students to try and kind of jump into a forum where everyone is trying to keep them out. That's, kind of getting into those journals is a tall order for anyone, not only, and particularly for a grad student.
When I hear about all this discussion about, frequency of publication, of course it's important in the academic world. That's how your reputations are built. But it got me thinking a little bit about the way that China works in many respects. So there's oftentimes this emphasis on quantity and not necessarily on quality. So, for example, the Chinese take great pride in saying that they have more patents than any other country in the world, and they surpass the United States on patent filings. But when you actually talk to scientists and you talk to people in the business who look at these patents, the quality of what they're submitting is actually not very high. It's just a huge number coming in. And everything with China has big numbers. Do you have any concern that there's this drive to publish and get published, but the quality of the research isn't necessarily the priority? Cobus, I'd like to hear from you, and then maybe Geraud, get your take on that.
That certainly is a concern, but it's not a concern that's unique to China. That's a concern that's part of academic life as a whole. And it brings with it a whole bunch of issues, including, for example, this issue of graduate students having language competence and then supervisors kind of riding on that in order to co-publish, which is, which was mentioned in relation to Chinese supervisors. That is even more true for Western supervisors of Chinese students. Frequently, a lot of Western supervisors who work on China would co-write with graduate students, and then, kind of that graduate student would be doing a lot of the work and doing particularly a lot of translation and a lot of primary source processing. And then, the supervisor steps in and is published as the main author. And that's not even only in China-related stuff. That happens throughout PhD study. Kind of part of what it shows is just the kind of really unrealistic level of pressure that is facing graduate students trying to get into an ever-shrinking, ever-eroding academic job market. And what we've seen is that the job market is so tight that in a lot of cases it ends up being like real conflict, real fights between graduate students trying to get into positions that don't even pay any salary. So there was this very, very controversial thing in California University, I think last year, advertising a position that they were clearly saying this is an unpaid position, but you had to have like 2 or 3 listed journal articles already published and like very high level like PhD work already done in order to get into an unpaid position. So that kind of unpaid labor is unfortunately the backbone of a lot of academic institutions, particularly very, very high status, very expensive ones.
That was at UCLA in Los Angeles that ran that ad. And by the way, for much of late last year, the grad students and the adjunct faculty at UC Berkeley went on strike for that very reason. So this, again, to your point, Cobus, is not an issue that's unique to China, but something happened even in the most prestigious.
Yeah, UK academics nationwide are going on strike later this month in relation to, kind of a whole set of labor issues, and kind of this is part of it.
Okay, Geraud, get in there.
For me, it's like to get back a bit on what Yurik said about quantity versus quality. I think last year there was a report that was published saying that Chinese papers are the most cited and quoted papers in the academics in the world right now. Basically, it just tells you that, they've also, as much as they're pushing for quantity, they're more and more pushing for the quality. So when you put that in a context where China is trying to become that academic power in a certain way, you kind of understand why now we see the phenomenon that we're seeing now, where you see university changing goalposts, putting high level of pressure on PhD students. And it's going to even get harder when you mention it, when you talk about the fact that, I think it's Cobus who said that you have a student coming from the global south, doing PhD studies in China. They just did maybe 2 or 1 year of studying Chinese, and they find themselves writing a 3-4 years, going for 3-4 years program in PhD in China. In Chinese, it's just not so easy. So when they put you under that much pressure, you kind of find yourself in a situation where it's quite difficult. And I even wanted to come back to the point where I think we didn't talk about it that much. The level of power that supervisor hold in Chinese university, it's tremendous power. It's quite surprising that somehow you can find a student just trying to get a paper published or something moving in his program, but once the supervisor say no, you can find yourself writing to Chinese ministry or to your embassy just to find something for him to move, and that's really not easy. I think that's something that I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, but what I've noticed, the power of Chinese supervisors over students, especially foreign students, is really too much.
Cobus, that's kind of the case everywhere, isn't it? The supervisor has an enormous amount of influence over students' well-being at that university.
Yes, but formally, and in that case, I think East Asian universities are particularly kind of, it's a serious issue there, because kind of East Asian supervisors hold a lot of power, as Geraud said, also over the scholarships of that foreign students are on. But that's true everywhere. Kind of the supervisor is absolutely crucial to almost all aspects of a PhD student success, and kind of formally in terms of things getting published and graduating and so on, but also I think more importantly informally, because a lot of supervisors make these kind of they use these kind of informal networks in order to then position the students to get jobs later. So it's a notorious thing in graduate studies around the world, where if a student has a kind of a breakdown in relations with their supervisor and then ends up finding their job prospects essentially poisoned everywhere, kind of that is it's the reality, kind of graduate life, and particularly, you find, there's several famous cases where graduate students were fighting competing to get into the programs of particularly prominent supervisors, only to have those supervisors then, for example, have face issues around sexual harassment or other kind of scandals, and then a lot of grad students finding their career prospects dead in the water because of their association with the supervisor. So, the supervisor is crucial, like in positive and negative ways. Like they can really make or break a career.
There is another thing about supervisor. It touches upon how China, in terms of scholarship program, process of China is giving the scholarship. For example, in my case in Japan, it was when I was going for my master, I kind of knew who was going to be my supervisor. We had a talk before, what was my subject and everything. But in China, I noticed that many students would go for master, even PhD, without even knowing who the supervisor is. They're going to arrive there, and that's the moment they find out, they discover who's the supervisor. So they kind of find themselves in a position where they cannot back out. So there is a kind of double blindsiding process in terms of conditions of graduating, the way it changes, in terms of even knowing who's going to be a supervisor during your program.
Well, let's leave the conversation there. By the way, we're going to have some research coming out later this year, maybe early next year, from Geraud, who is looking at what happens to African students who return from China with their degrees and whether or not they're applying the knowledge that they pick up in China to their postgraduate life in Africa and in African countries in their home countries. So that's going to be a fascinating piece of research that we're looking forward to seeing later this year or early next year. We'll keep everybody apprised of that. Of course, if this is a topic that you are interested in following, we cover all of these issues in our daily brief newsletter that the whole team here puts together. We're just so excited about the work that everybody's doing in our daily brief and also in French and in Arabic. And Geraud, he puts out a newsletter twice a week in French. You can go to our French site, Projet Afrique Chine. The link is in the show notes. Sign up right at the top. It's absolutely free. For our English service, there's a small subscription fee, but we think it's absolutely worth it. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And we have a half-off rate for students and faculty. Just drop me an email with your academic email address at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com, and I'll be happy to send you the coupons for that discounted rate of half off a subscription. So let's leave it there. Cobus, Geraud, and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at ProjetAfriqueChine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.